Welcome to China Power. I'm Bonnie Lin, your host, and in this podcast, we dissect critical issues underpinning China as a global power. Today, I'm joined by Robert Greenway, director of the Allison Center for National Security at the Heritage Foundation. Rob brings more than 30 years of public service, including serving as a senior U.S. government official on the National Security Council, as a senior intelligence officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency, and as a U.S. Army Special Forces officer. In this episode, we will discuss his new report, Tidal Wave: Strategic Exploitation and Sustainment in a U.S.-China Conflict. Rob, thank you for joining me.
My great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, Rob, I'd like to start off by asking you a teaser question. What have you found most interesting or most surprising as you've looked at the Chinese military or Chinese strategic defense behavior in the last year or so? And that should not be the finding of your report, which we'll talk about later.
No, sure, and appreciate the question. I think the degree to which they continue to be provocative and escalatory, which does nothing, I think, but engender a response from the United States, our partners and allies, to do more, which seems a little counterintuitive, but nonetheless, they continue.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll follow up on that with you in a second, but I do want to get to your report first. So your report and project is called Operation Tidal Wave, from the World War II mission that struck German fuel lifeline to cripple its abilities to sustain its war. And your report focuses on assessing critical PRC fuel and ammunition vulnerabilities. What is your report's top and most important findings?
Sure. The United States is not prepared to project and sustain the joint force, which culminates before the Chinese does, which ultimately could and very likely would lead to strategic defeat.
And what is your most important recommendation that links to that finding?
Well, I'd say there are two. Generally, identifying the vulnerabilities that we uncovered in the report and the specific corrective measures, which I'm sure we'll talk about, involve expanding our capacity to deliver fuel and ammunition in crisis, and also expansion of forward hardened infrastructure to support the force once it arrives. And the second is commensurate with it, is buying down Chinese culmination by attacking their critical vulnerabilities.
Thank you. And before we go into the detailed vulnerabilities on the Chinese side, on the fuel side, or on the ammunition side, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about how groundbreaking your report is in terms of its methodology. So your report used a mix of expert judgment plus AI-enabled data processing and then a year-long simulation about sustainment. And I was absolutely fascinated by how many AI tools you used, including OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google's Gemini, xAI Super Grok, Anthropic's Claude, among others. And your report specifically notes you utilized, quote, over 16,000 live hookups and large language model queries, and then that you analyzed over 7,000 curated sources. Could you walk us through how you designed the research, and to what extent did all these AI tools really enable you to do research that we haven't been able to do in the past?
Sure. I think it's probably important to say upfront just how the project itself was structured and why. We undertook this project to determine U.S. and Chinese culmination in a protracted conflict, one that extends 365 days at a minimum. And to do that, we looked at the sustainment systems of both the United States and China, specifically fuel and ammunition, as well as the construct of both joint forces and the operational environment in which we would meet and the variables in which that conflict would occur, so that we could gauge attrition and consumption of critical resources. And in doing so, we would identify both our and their vulnerabilities. So that's the broader framework in which our methodology was applied. As you'd expect, the scope of this effort is so vast that it would be impossible for almost any number of individuals to accomplish even in a year. And so we had to employ a couple of things to do that. Computational power, which is increasingly available. The second are tools, including those that you mentioned, in order to acquire data and refine research. And then the last critical part of this is really the subject matter expert on staff and those among our partners to help us guide and direct the process to where we could get really reliable conclusions and results. And so very unique effort, unprecedented, has not been attempted either in and out of government. And I also think it's unique among public policy foundations to do this level of detailed systems analysis in order to uncover vulnerabilities and provide very specific recommendations. So you mentioned a couple of different tools. I would say that for us, artificial intelligence is a term usually defined by the user at the time it's used. It's very difficult to pin down what it means. For us, it was really using the existing tools in competition with each other to acquire data and to be able to support expert analysis. So we didn't use AI for analysis. We use it really to acquire valid data and to be able, to model the systems themselves, but it were the experts who judged where the vulnerabilities reside and then rank ordered them according to standard intelligence community directive tradecraft, which we followed throughout the construct of the report, and it's detailed in the methodology chapter. And we did that, one, to make sure it's discoverable, verifiable, repeatable, and also so that many of our clients, so to speak, in government could receive this report and immediately utilize it. And I say client in the loosest possible term because, as you know, Heritage takes no money from the federal government, not ours or any other, nor from defense industry.
So, Rob, I don't want to spend too much time nerding out on your methodology, but it's so fascinating and so unprecedented, as you mentioned. So, can I ask you, given the fact that you needed to have experts review the information that the AI generated, how many people overall, both on your team as well as throughout the wider community, did you have to involve in this process?
It's a great question. I'd say about 40 to 50 people were involved over the course of the project, over the course of the year. Many on staff within Heritage and many partners in experts in industry, energy in particular, but also infrastructure. And then obviously in the maritime domain features prominently in the report, as well as air. So I'd say about 40, 50 people. But in the end, the core group of people involved day to day for the course of the year was about 12.
Awesome. Okay, now let's talk about your actual findings, which I found were quite excellent, both on the fuel side and on the ammunition side. And of course, you also have a U.S. focus in your report too, which we'll touch on. So let's start with Chinese vulnerabilities on the fuel side. What did you find as the key vulnerabilities?
Sure. And let me first preface this by saying, for those that have downloaded the publicly accessible report, that they'll notice, of course, as you did, that it's heavily redacted, which I don't know that has been done before. It's certainly never been done at Heritage. And we did that in consultation with our partners in the U.S. government, knowing that they would not want us to release previously unidentified vulnerabilities in the Chinese system, which would allow them time to correct and prevent us from exploiting it fully. So that's the reason it's redacted. That language is in the report, but I wanted to make that clear. Second, to your direct question, we found that the Chinese fuel system has a number of vulnerabilities, but it's also important to recognize what its strengths are. They've been radically working to correct the deficiencies because they are externally dependent, as you and many of your listeners will know. It is an exogenic system. It must have external inputs. Fuel is one of the most important, and it is not decreasing. In fact, it's climbing based on demand. Two, part of their corrective actions include a massive strategic petroleum reserve, which is now about 1.3 billion barrels, 1.2 at the time we went to publication. That gives them a massive shock absorber and allows them to continue. And it means that their culmination from a fuel standpoint largely stretches out throughout the entirety of the year, almost independent of actions taken, with a few exceptions. Second, that fuel is largely unrefined until demand is present. So either commercially or militarily, a demand signal is sent and then the system's refined, which means that the storage is not really the vulnerability. It is the distribution and delivering to the need and the individual customers, in this case, military. Now, the vulnerabilities to your specific question encompass really the external components of the system that are sourced outside the People's Republic of China. And most of their systems, whether ammunition or fuel, are largely sourced externally. And so they constitute significant vulnerabilities. Naturally, not every part of this vast system is a critical vulnerability that would meet the criteria established, and we used Carver to do it, which is criticality, accessibility, recoverability, vulnerability, effect on the populace, and recognizability. And many will recognize that framework as being an intelligence community and Department of War standard. And so we identified and rank ordered hundreds of vulnerabilities in both systems. But it's the external dependency on commodities that make the system operate and function properly or not that constitute the biggest vulnerabilities in their system.
And Rob, in terms of China's massive strategic reserve, I think you mentioned 1.3 billion. What does that actually mean in terms of how China could translate that into military operations? Are you suggesting that without any imports, China could sustain operations for a prolonged period of time? What does that assume in terms of suppression of civilian demand?
Right, great question. And of course, the benefit of a simulation as opposed to a war game allows us to, one, model basically every known variable across the full spectrum of potential outcomes. And second, at a level of detail, having modeled the entirety of the system. So we can glean a lot of it and stand on pretty high statistical probability. The bottom line is, as you suggest, is that massive quantity allows them to support the military for a significant period of time, even if their imports were degraded. Now, over time, of course, that will impact. And over time, of course, in consultation or in collaboration with actions taken against their system, could become catastrophic. And that's what we suggest. But it is an important point that it'd take a while before imports alone impact the system, but they eventually will. The second point I would make is that there is a fine line between commercial demand and military demand, and it's obviously circumstantial. And we looked at up to a 30% diversion from the civilian economy requiring petrochemicals to the military, which is completely petrochemical based, as is every military. And in the end, they could still manage to sacrifice to the civilian economy and support the military. And part of that is because their commute to work for the Chinese, for the People's Liberation Army and Navy, are obviously a great deal shorter than ours. Our problem is projecting for some 2,500 miles. They don't have that problem even out to the second island chain, really. And so fuel is an issue for them, but it's an issue that will require a concerted action beyond just the limitation of imports, which must happen and probably will have to happen early. And disruption we modeled in their fuel system will have to occur very early on in a conflict if it's to have the desired effect. But it must happen, or they'll be able to extend operations far beyond ours, as we'll discuss, I'm sure, in a minute.
So when you say that China could sustain operations for a significant period of time, even if imports were degraded, are you talking about months or weeks?
Oh, it's definitely months. And again, it depends on the intensity of the conflict, the scope and scale, the geography that's encompassed within it. There are obviously a number of variables, but in almost every variable, they could extend the conflict upwards of 360 days based on fuel alone, unless disruption is made to their system.
And you mentioned a second ago that it's very important to target China's fuel vulnerabilities as early as possible in a conflict. What are some of the top ways, and I know a good portion of your report is redacted here, what are some of your top recommendations for how to target China's fuel vulnerabilities?
Yeah, the first, of course, is the recognition or the decision that it must be done. It is a strategic vulnerability. You mentioned the project takes its name from Operation Tidal Wave, the attack against German oil fields in Romania in 1943, for precisely this reason. We're basically hearkening back to a time in which we were engaged heavily in strategic targeting against an adversary's economy. We advocate an absolute necessity to return to that methodology and that mentality. And that's one of the observations of the report is we are inadequately prepared to do so. Second is those decisions have to be made quickly because, as I suggested, once they make the decision to go from unrefined to refined product for military application, then the system becomes so distributed as it's much more difficult. And second, a conflict, of course, incurs a change in the threat to air environment, and that would obviously make the interdiction difficult in later stages of a conflict. We're suggesting that the earlier the better, again, to bring their culmination below our own. And again, it comes down to the distribution of the fuel itself at the point of need within the military system itself, less so in storage. And I would also add that, as I suggest, refinery potential operates on demand, so refineries also constitute a critical vulnerability.
So I found your report to be timely for a number of reasons, but also including the fact that we are currently seeing a escalating conflict in the Middle East, of which that is impacting the oil coming from the Middle East, but also specifically Iran. In your report, you mentioned that China's fuel system is heavily dependent on oil from Iran, and you cite that in 2024, China imported 1.5 million barrels of crude oil per day from Iran. Given what's happening right now in the Middle East, how do you see the conflict and Iran's attempt to close down the Strait of Hormuz? How's that affecting the PLA if we were to, for example, to have a conflict now against China?
Sure, great question. I think two observations. First is what the president and the administration are doing now is of strategic necessity. Whether we're talking about Venezuela, some of the world's largest proven reserves and a tremendous output, or Iran. The president's coordination with partners and allies in the Middle East, his first trip again this term, as it was in his first term, was to the Middle East to shore up our relationships so that we could manage global energy markets, not because we need the energy, as you suggest. We're now the world's leading producer and a net exporter, but China is completely dependent upon Middle Eastern oil, specifically Iranian. Some 43% of their oil is coming from the Middle East, and that is a significant percentage. Obviously, that impacts a military that is completely beholden to the use of oil. And so the president's actions do, one, control the price. That affects Moscow as it does Beijing. It throttles access to revenue for Putin. In 2024, Russian GDP growth was 4.25%, and the country was obviously running on almost entirely gas exports, oil and gas exports. Last year, they went down to 1.25% because of the drop in price of oil, because of the president's actions. And so whether it's Caracas or whether it's Tehran, actions taken by the United States demonstrate, one, the vulnerability the Chinese have, and two, opportunity for the United States to exert greater influence so that we could deter. And if a conflict begins, we would have the ability to constrain access to a critical resource. And again, our judgment is that that is essential. It's not optional.
And to your point about how dependent China is on Iranian oil, there's a really curious case that actually occurred on February 27th, just one day before the beginning of the U.S.-Israeli military campaign against Iran, in which we saw Chinese air intrusions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone drop. And that's been quite a sustained drop for, almost 2 weeks now. There's a variety of speculations of why that's occurred, but one speculation is that the disruptions in oil from the Middle East could have motivated this. Could you share your thoughts on this, and to what extent do you see disruptions in oil potentially even affecting peacetime PLA operations?
That's a great question. It'd be speculation on my part. What I would suggest, though, is that the president in the United States' willingness to use force in Venezuela and now in Iran, I think, shores up and greatly reinforces deterrence. It demonstrates the will. Everyone knows the United States has great capacity, has unprecedented capacity. What has always been sort of questionable is whether or not the United States has the will to use it and under what circumstances. And I think now Beijing may have pause in trying to determine under what circumstance this president would use force. And that may have resulted in some hesitation, and I suspect ultimately it will. Second, though, of course, the protracted conflict in the Middle East could see a depletion of critical resources moving from one theater to another, which happens when we have insufficient platforms, as we argue. So I think that also contributes to it. But in the end, I think it's a positive step towards greater deterrence, and it does expose the Chinese vulnerability for what it is. And I'd also add that China is not coming to the assistance of its chief Middle Eastern source of oil, nor its nominal security partner. Neither is Russia. And I think that also sends an important signal to the rest of the world that China is probably unwilling, almost certainly unable, to really do anything to come to the aid of its nominal partners and allies. And I think that's not lost on them.
And this might be a level of detail beyond your report, but when you looked at China's dependency on Iranian oil, did your analysis also model that if China faced shortages in fuel, what type of operations would be impacted most immediately, and what type of operations China might think about cutting off or reducing?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely well within the scope of the report, which is among the most detailed I think I've ever read in the public domain. And in fact, in the government domain, I'd add as well. And so, yes, we looked at consumption across the range of scenarios by day, by location, by type. And that incredible amount of detailed analysis is summarized in the report. And we have the ability, of course, to model virtually any outcome. And in the end, the answer to your question is it does depend on a couple of variables, like when it occurs. Most importantly, it's less about the source of import than it is about actions taken against their system. In the end, though, I would say that if I had to answer it specifically, it would be air operations are the most sensitive to fuel disruptions, just because of the fuel used and the refining processes involved are a little bit more involved than the maritime domain.
Absolutely fascinating. Okay, let's move now to what your report is finding on the ammunition side. What are the most important vulnerabilities you found, and what are your top recommendations for targeting those Chinese vulnerabilities?
Sure. And without, of course, unredacting a redacted report, I would say that, like the fuel system, the Chinese have enormous vulnerabilities. They are expanding their inventory of long range precision strike munitions, the ones that matter most, but their stockpiles are not vastly larger than ours at all. They have a slight advantage, unlike in the fuel side, where they have a significant advantage, mostly because of proximity. What I would say is their vulnerabilities include, but are not limited to, production, manufacture, distribution, and storage. Again, dependencies on external components and parts that make the system function properly. I would also say that many of the component parts of the missiles themselves are still externally sourced. And until restrictions are put in place, we're subsidizing the expansion of the rocket inventory that threatens us. And we judge and argue, of course, that that should not be so. Um, it is surprising to us just how many external dependencies are in both systems, including the ammunition system.
And Rob, if I read your report correctly, it suggests to me that China is most dependent on external components for its most advanced capabilities. Is that correct? Or
No,
is China dependent across the board?
that is generally correct, although some of their dependencies are distributed regardless of the type of ammunition produced. And so, for example, is storage distribution. Those site vulnerabilities, which we are very specific about in the report, but are obviously redacted, encompass regardless of what type of munition is stored. But you're right in that the specific types of munition themselves are generally more vulnerable the more complex and advanced that they are. In other words, more valuable to them and more dangerous to us.
And to me, like when I read this portion of your report, I couldn't help noticing how many times in talking about different ammunition, foreign source choke points, you mentioned the United States and key U.S. allies and partners. It seems like there's a lot that we could be doing on this end to be able to target China's ammunition vulnerabilities.
There absolutely are. And we obviously account for the fact that transshipment occurs, that a commodity may go to a given destination and ultimately uh, be shipped beyond it in some ways in violation of our export control and enforcement regulations. Nonetheless, it is absolutely true that most of the systems that are going into advanced weapons in China have Western origin, and that obviously is a small number of countries, including our own.
Do you see enough effort on the US end as well as with our allies and partners to limit these components to China right now?
No, no, obviously not. Because I don't assume, because I know it's not true that we intend to provide them components for advanced missiles. Obviously, I think everyone would say that we do not. However, we are not taking sufficient steps ourselves or with our partners and allies and with our trading partners, frankly, that in many cases, wittingly or perhaps unwittingly, are allowing transshipment of critical commodities to continue and other critical services. It covers a very broad spectrum. And we obviously uncovered this in exhausting detail in the report. And what's redacted is incredibly specific. And in most cases, the redacted components of the report had not been previously identified. So there are too few actions taken for too many critical vulnerabilities which have Western origin.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, it's good to know that what's been redacted are new areas of measures that we should be taking or new PRC vulnerabilities that haven't been identified publicly.
Yeah. And that's the result of doing such an exhaustive analysis of their system. It isn't done at a distance. It isn't done at a sort of research level. And it's not opinion. We wanted to get past that into exhaustive, comprehensive argument. But to be able to do that, we had to model the entirety of the fuel and ammunition systems for both countries, which is a daunting task, but it's worth it. And in the end, the results of the report yield that.
Fantastic. I do want to spend a little bit of time on the vulnerabilities on the U.S. side, particularly as we look at what's happening right now in the Middle East. I should have noted earlier that we were recording this on March 16th. Of course, the conflict in Iran and the Middle East is evolving. But Rob, as you look at what's happening there, to what extent does the conflict there re-emphasize the stark finding in your report where you say, quote, Heritage judges that it is very likely that a high-intensity conflict in the Indo-Pacific will trigger a cascading failure of the U.S. Indo-Pacific military fuel system.
Yeah. Our problem isn't availability of fuel. The United States, as I mentioned, is now one of the leading world producers and a net exporter. The problem is we don't have the distribution capacity. So we get a significant several hundreds of thousands of barrel per day shortfall very early in the conflict, which we can't reconcile. So it's transport capacity. Also, our strategic petroleum reserve is largely located on the southern coast, the Gulf of America, not the West Coast, which is a problem. But our transport capacity is a real problem. This also is significant because it had not been identified, which means we haven't requested the ships required to do it, which is very specific in our recommendations in the report itself. This also will apply to ammunition, as we'll talk about. The second is we don't have the forward deployed infrastructure, which is largely well known. I think what we do differently is we prove and we quantify the deficiency. And then we are very specific in the corrective action required, which is why our recommendations haven't been disclosed anywhere else because no one had done that level of analysis. So we do identify things that have been previously recognized, the lack of infrastructure, the loss of Red Hill in Hawaii, but the lack of forward deployed infrastructure and lack of hardened forward infrastructure complicates things. The need to accelerate refuel at sea, also well known, but perhaps not as dire, I think, perhaps as we identify in the report. So it is a throughput issue. It is systemic. It can be fixed, but it will require action which previously had not been requested.
And just as you were referencing earlier, your report also has pretty dire assessments of the U.S. Munitions in the Indo-Pacific, particularly when you're looking at a high-intensity conflict where there will be significant attrition, supply chain ceilings, and industrial lag. And I think this also builds off of some of the work that some of my CSIS colleagues have focused on. So from your perspective, what is the most important thing listeners should take away from your report on U.S. munitions in the Indo-Pacific?
A couple of things. First is if you ask what is the correct number of munitions for any type, I don't think there's a cogent answer that anyone can provide. Whether that's for an Indo-Pacific conflict or whether it's broadly two major regional contingencies and a strategic reserve, nor does it necessarily account for our partners and allies. So we're basically operating without a definitive goal. And that means that we have unidentified risk, which is unacceptable. And it's probably why we found ourselves in a circumstance where we've depleted critical low density munitions without an idea of what's required to stockpile them. And now we are incredibly concerned with the risk that we're experiencing, including conflicts in the Middle East, as well as those in the first land war in Europe since the Second World War. So we don't have a definitive number because the analysis hasn't been done. That's got to be changed. Second, we obviously have insufficient munitions. Everyone, I think, says this. What we do differently is we prove by day across the range of scenarios what the demand actually is for an Indo-Pacific conflict and what the numbers required should be. And this we wanted to do to inform Congress, our chief target audience for this report, to be able to get the correct number and the corrective action required to get us to the right production numbers. Second, we will culminate from an ammunition perspective in just over a month. And that means our entire inventory of most critical munitions required to sustain the modern joint force in a conflict with a near-peer adversary like China, that is at a ridiculously short period of time, which means we're incredibly sensitive to consumption elsewhere, including in the Middle East or in Europe. And that includes our partners and allies who are in many ways also customers and users of some of those critical munitions, of which there are really about 30. You could argue less than that. But in the end, I think we come up with, we track all munitions, so well over 100 by day for both sides. But it's about 30 types of munitions, which are absolutely essential to this conflict. And I would also point out, too, that because we do this by type by day, we discover just how vulnerable our services are in a high-intensity conflict from a defensive standpoint alone.
So when you say our munition stockpile will culminate in a month, that's the stockpile prior to this conflict in Iran, right?
That's correct. Our analysis obviously was published in January, so it doesn't include consumption since then. We're looking to update that now. We are updating it in our analysis, and we hope to publish in the next couple of weeks once the conflict is concluded, which I hope it is soon and believe it will be. But we don't yet have new numbers for consumption. But obviously, it all matters. Obviously, PAC-3 and THAAD, interceptors in particular, but TLAMs as well, are somewhat sensitive. But again, we didn't start out in a very good position. So decrementing it further only makes this even more an acute crisis.
And to your point about the excellent work your team did in modeling the demand for munitions by scenario by day, is there any way you can share some of that, or is that on the end of being too sensitive to be released?
We didn't share all of the details publicly. We did with our partners in government, both Congress as well as the executive branch of the Department of War and the intelligence community. We may release additional detail on the consumption figures. We are working towards a publicly accessible version of the platform itself, which will include that level of detail. We're just now working through the technical aspects of hosting it on the web. But we do have a user interface which allows you to run the scenarios in general without modification, and then look at consumption and attrition in real time by location for both sides. So that information will be made available. It'll just take us a little bit of time to work through the technical aspects.
Well, that would be excellent to have that information available. I guess for now, could you share with us what scenarios you looked at?
Sure. And generally, as outlined in the report, we looked at four broad categories of varying intensity. Whether both sides had high intensity and were matched, or whether there was an offset between intensity. And that's basically the pace and scale and scope of operations conducted. Obviously, there's a great many details in each of the scenarios themselves, and then a series of events which are manually inserted across all of the scenarios at different times to be able to judge the impact that it has, including our own actions as well as theirs. So we looked at high and low intensity, equal or mismatches between the four sides. All scenarios begin with, but are not limited to, conflict in Taiwan. It's one of our key findings that it may start in Taiwan, but it will expand rapidly beyond it, because a force in motion will stay in motion. And without the platforms and munitions, the physics of conflict, the People's Liberation Army, Navy, rocket forces will all continue their advance unless they're stopped by a requisite force. And that means that they'll go well beyond the first and probably into the second island chain if they're allowed an opportunity to do so, as they are right now. And that's why weakness and an inability to address our deficiencies in this report really fuel a lack of deterrence and incentivize conflict, which is also one of our findings. So it begins with a quarantine blockade. It expands from invasion to first and then to second island chain, with global disruption actions taken, including in the continental United States. All that's outlined, obviously, in the methodology chapter of the report. And I'll just add that, again, the advantage of simulation over wargaming is it allows us to do basically innumerable evolutions of a given construct once the platform is built, which is one of the great utilities of having this type of capability. Is you now then have the capacity to run almost infinite numbers of scenarios to judge the response of a given system under different effects. And that has obviously tremendous utility.
Thank you. Yeah, as we mentioned earlier, I'm very fascinated with your methodology, and I think it's one in which other think tanks and other researchers should look into more, to be able to leverage, as you mentioned, the great power that we have now with processing that that goes far beyond what individual researchers or even individual teams can do. So Rob, I'd like to wrap up this podcast by asking you what your top recommendation was, pulling this back to where we are in DC right now when it comes to thinking through our relationship with China. What is the easiest for U.S. allies and partners to do that your report has identified?
Well, as we lay out in the report, it is critically vital for us to increase our munitions production by type based on a known requirement. Our anticipated use in the Pacific conflict, but also in other major regional contingencies, and a strategic reserve. What are the actual requirements? What are the actual numbers? And I say that because we have limited time to do it. As you know, and your listeners know, President Xi has stated that the PLA needs to be prepared to conduct an invasion potentially by 2027, which is now looming. So we have very little time, which means we have to focus. And we can't spread our resources across 120 different types of munitions or multiple equal options across services, even in the U.S. We have to be very specific. Second, it does need to encompass partners and allies. The greater degree our partners and allies are equipped, the less the burden is in the United States. We didn't talk about it today, but we did look at partners and allies initially, but we stopped because we judged that they don't have the resources necessary to alter significantly the trajectory of a conflict. And that is a sad state to be in, but it's realistic. And that also must be corrected as a matter of priority. And I would give credit to, Japan is taking incredible steps. Australia is moving aggressively, but both will require U.S. support and assistance. The second is we've got to strategically understand that the systems that support the PLA are strategic in nature and critically important, and they must be acted upon. And that requires planning and preparation. This is not about the defense of Taiwan. It is about the defense of U.S. trade in Asia and the stability of global energy and trade markets as a whole. And that economic threat, the adverse economic impact of a conflict with China, is 10% of global GDP, which would put the world in global recession, many in global depression. That's a massive figure, and that's what we're trying to prevent. And to do that, we need to accelerate the expenditure and to prioritize those things which are critically required to bring the Chinese culmination down below the United States and extend our own. The good news is we plot a course forward that can achieve this based on rigorous analysis and exhaustive study. And I think there's hope that we've got traction and attention having done this work before and gone beyond, again, opinion and judgment as solidly on fact as we possibly could.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rob, for joining me today on this podcast to share key findings from your report, the fascinating research methodology that you used, but also that you will actually be sharing more of your report, or at least more parts of your report publicly, which I think I'm very fascinated in the parts that are not publicly available right now.
Well, it's my great pleasure. Thanks for having me.